Lightbearer, The Crimson Chronicle, Part 1. Written by J.A. Hawk. Read for you by Joshua Garner. Chapter 18. One to be Feared. Fletch had taken up the long oar from the deck of the ship and maneuvered the breeze skimmer away from the docks. He pushed at the bottom of the bay with the oar, but the Sky Darter was much too large a vessel for him to do more than fend the ship off from the dock and turn its prow towards open water. "Felix?" Fletch grunted. His breathing was labored as he dipped the long pole into the water. "I don't plan on pushing this thing all the way across the broken shore. Do whatever you need to do to get us going." When the oar no longer hit the bottom, the fox hauled the pole up and dropped it back upon the deck. "Be patient, I'm working through it," Felix said uncertainly. He was hastily examining various knobs and levers, clear additions which operated flight and surrounded the spoked wheel at the helm of the ship. Experimentally, he pulled or twisted a few, to little effect, except for the sound of hidden mechanisms from below decks clunking softly. "Wait a second," he said curiously. Felix rubbed his thumb over a small jewel set in the control board, full of strange gauges. Fate felt the prince draw upon the light briefly, just as she had taught him to do. Then a small white light emitted from the controls about Felix. "Of course," Felix said excitedly. "I'm so stupid." The prince slapped a paw to his forehead, then pointed towards the mechanical devices set about the outside of the ship, which looked like thin metal insect wings. "Those react to light. They need to be moving for the rest of it to work. Can you two get them going? I'm not sure exactly what you should do, but those are supposed to spin." The Sky Darter was not a huge vessel. It had obviously been converted from a seafaring ship and not specifically built for skybound forays. It supported a deeper hull and had a cargo hold below, the access to which was set in the center of the ship and had been covered over with a light mesh of wooden planks. Upon each corner of the ship there were 4 mechanisms of equal design, 2 at the bow and 2 at the stern. The mechanisms had 2 fins each. The outside ring was made of a thin metal, which might have been gold, but more likely polished brass. Between each fin was an arrangement of thin gossamer strands, which sparkled in the golden light and gave the device the distinct look of a dragonfly wing. They rotated back and forth listlessly with the slight jostling of the sea current. "What do you reckon?" Fletch asked, looking at the devices. "An air technique, I assume," Fate said calculatingly. "What else could it be?" "All right, let's start there," Fletch agreed. Fate and Fletch moved to either side of the deck. The Drake had taken up a position resting upon the planks that covered over the cargo hold in an attempt to keep his weight centered and evenly balanced upon the ship. The wooden slats bent slightly under his bulk, but not worryingly enough to warrant him moving anywhere else more perilous. With a strong grip, his long claws hooked through the mesh of the planks, anchoring the large lizard to the deck. The fox and the rabbit looked at one another, then began to draw upon the light in tandem. Both focused it through their respective lithium crystals. Together they formed a technique that infused the air around each of the wing devices of the Sky Darter. The thin metal props began to rotate, somewhat jittery and haltingly to begin with. Then they became smooth and efficient as rotational momentum took over. At the center of each mechanism began to glow a lithium crystal, light green in color and previously hidden by the darkness. "That's it," Felix exclaimed. "Whatever you're doing, keep at it. A whole bunch of lights just lit up here on the board." The others did not need Felix's confirmation, as the Sky Darter had begun to move forward unassisted by any means they could see. It cut a swath through the water of the sheltered bay, gaining speed. An errant wave hit the prow of the ship, shaking all aboard. Fate staggered at the sudden jerk, and her technique faltered as she hit the deck. However, The now rapidly spinning mechanisms seemed to not need their assistance any further and hummed with a gentle sound. Fletch ended his technique and offered a paw to Fate, pulling her to her feet. The Sky Darter kept moving forward, but still at a determinedly sea-level elevation. The waves began to crash into them one after the other, sending the hull of the ship up and down violently. The watery assault only became more aggressive the further they moved from the port. "Not to complain," Fletch called out over the sea spray of a particularly big wave, "but these things usually go up, if you know what I mean." "I think I nearly got it," Prince Felix said, and then triumphantly exclaimed, "Yes!" He pulled one of the levers at the side of the wheel. There was a loud sound of rushing air, and the ballast above became suddenly taut against its rigging. Crash, crash, crash. Wave after wave hit the speeding vessel, each more violently than the last. Fate and Fletch both dropped to their knees, holding on to whatever part of the ship, or deck, they could reach, using him as an impromptu anchor. The Drake lifted into the air, bouncing slightly as the hull plunged, but his strong paws kept a hold of the planks over the cargo hold, rooting him down. Crash, crash, crash. Silence. 4 awe-stricken gasps could be heard over the hum of whirring mechanisms, as the Sky Darter finally made worthy its name and lifted from sea to sky. Prince Felix took a while familiarizing himself with how the Sky Darter handled, now that it had shed its watery confinement. At first he was very timid, barely turning the spoked wheel, seeing how the vessel reacted. Then, after a few more cautionary attempts, he began to make more aggressive tests of the ship. Fate thought he was doing well, considering when she looked at the arrangement of levers, it made her head positively hurt. Before long, Felix had the Sky Darter's bow pointed in the direction of the retreating Temple Sky vessel, and with another blast of air, the Sky Darter slowly started gaining altitude. Fate moved to the edge of the breeze skimmer, resting one paw on the balustrade that ran around the edge of the ship, and looked down upon the city of Heldor. The city was alive with a fevered commotion, softly lit by the unnatural golden light given off by the temple vessel far above. Her heart went out to the inhabitants below. Fires raged across the city, and there was a mad scurry to douse the hungry flames before they spread. Fate was unsure if that was the doing of the army or negligence brought on by panic. Regardless, she felt somewhat cowardly as they sped away from the city. It was a stupid thought. She knew they could do little to stop what was taking place down below, but it still felt wrong. Once they caught up to the keeper, she was determined to reason with them, to convince them to turn back and supply succor to Heldor. The breeze was strong, and it made Fate's eyes water. She blinked, then let out an annoyed, "Huh." For the umpteenth time since taking to the air, her long ears had swung around and slapped her in the face from an errant gust of wind. She grabbed them tightly with a paw and was resolved to not let them go until they were grounded again. "Here," Fletch said, prodding Fate. "Have a go with this." The fox held out a blue ribbon, which was usually wrapped around his toback pouch. Fate took the ribbon and quickly wrapped it down the length of her long ears, securing them together by a hasty knot. "Cute," Fletch noted once Fate had finished with her ears. Fate gave a small smile at the compliment, but her face fell when she saw Fletch's attention divert. He was watching the desperation of the city below. "It doesn't feel right," she said softly. "I don't like it much either," he replied. "We know the temple has strength. Why would they flee? Something is very wrong, and there better be a good reason behind it." "Yes," Fate agreed. "Lightbearers should not run when we can do good." Their conversation was disturbed as Deck made a move. With careful deliberation, the Drake got to his feet. then slowly moved around the breeze skimmer, examining every part of the ship his craning neck could reach. From the great inflated ballast above, down to the brackets that held the whirring mechanisms in place, each was given considerable attentions by the Drake. Fate couldn't help but smile, watching him slowly conduct his tour of the ship, curious as a burrowing outside the warren for the first time. Time moved on. It was hard to tell how long, as everything was lit by the even glow cast off from the temple vessel, and the lone moon gave little to no hint as everything was in perpetual motion. The city of Heldor was still visible below wisp of gold-tinted clouds, but only as a twinkling of lights on the edge of dark water. The mechanisms at either side of the Sky Darter hummed along contentedly, without any need of additional assistance from the two Lightbearers, engorged by the plethora of light given off by the temple. Fate had never felt such ambient light, so ready and available to be drawn upon. Prince Felix seemed to have little issue maneuvering the Sky Darter into the wake of the larger vessel, and was content to trail it until a time when the massive ship might shift its course toward a landing.
"Which one makes it go up?"
Edek had exhausted his examination of the wider ship and was now standing at the helm with Prince Felix. The prince glanced sidelong at the Drake. "I don't know if you should—" Felix was silenced by an annoyed snap of sharp-toothed jaws as the Drake stared him down menacingly. That one." Felix hesitantly pointed to a lever next to the spoked wheel. Edek reached out carefully with one of his very large paws. It took him a few attempts to get his curved claw around the delicate lever, but once he did, a blast of pressurized air lifted the vessel higher into the sky at the command. With the utmost care, the Drake released the lever, and Fate saw what was unmistakable joy in the Drake's eyes. At the increase in altitude, they were now flying slightly above the temple, sailing ahead. Fate could see down onto the deck of the massive ship. It was a strange sight. The most absurd components were arranged upon its deck. Bizarre juxtaposition of things such as water fountains or broken paths that clearly led to buildings, pruned, intertwining garden beds, and study alcoves. More disturbing was the silent and still mounds which lay at the edge of shadows. They gave Fate a terrible sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach that had nothing to do with altitude. The horrible feeling seemed to intensify, and even the stars and moon obscured as a darkness pressed in upon them. Suddenly, a heavy impact hit the front of the Sky Darter, and the whole ship pitched forward, sending everyone to the deck in a tangle of sprawling limbs.
"What was that?"
Fate cried out, but the rest of her tirade died in her throat. A large, dark figure came forward from the shadows at the bow of the ship into the ethereal light. The creature was known to Fate, and yet somehow unknown. The feeling of pure malice that emanated from the being, the black armor, deep as pitch, and the overwhelming feeling of dread was too familiar by half, and brought Fate right back to the terror below Wellborough.
"Shifter!"
Fate gasped. The shifter was well armored in its dark plate mail, which glinted like lacquer in the moonlight. It wore a helm that was shaped to cover a muzzled face, and it stood taller than even Edek. The eyes were shadowed, but their ominous presence was felt by whomever their gaze alighted upon. By some devilry unknown, any light that fell too close to the shifter was consumed. For a moment it stood looming in the darkness, looking down upon them silently. Then the shifter dismounted from another creature with heavy footfalls upon the deck. The mount's shape was hard to make out, as it seemed to be made of vile smoke, or the space which lay between stars. It was apart from the shifter, and yet, somehow, the same. The shifter strode a step away from the shadowy mount, and pulled from the darkness its wicked blade. The cruel iron was black, long and heavy. It came to a point made of crystal that was dark violet and seemed to draw nighttime to it. Edek screamed a tremendous roar at the sight of the shifter. It was a horrible sound, full of hatred and fear. Without warning, the drake brazenly rushed across the deck at the pair, his snarling scream splitting the calm breeze. Edek snapped at the shifter, attempting to seize the creature in his jaws, but the bulky armored menace moved quicker than expected. Dropping its sword, the shifter grabbed the drake around the muzzle with both arms, pinning his jaws shut. Pivoting its weight down and using the forward momentum of Edek, it pulled the drake's head under and sent him head over tail into the slatted planks that covered the cargo hold. Edek let out a surprised grunt as he landed full-bodied into the wooden beams over the hold. The slender slats splintered and gave way, snapping under the drake's weight. In a flurry of twisting limbs and flailing tail, the surprised Edek fell into the cargo hold with a stifled yelp. Without hesitation, the strange creature the shifter had dismounted dived into the cargo hold after the drake. Roars issued up from the hold, followed by a twisted scream as the two beasts, one of flesh, the other of fear, fought for dominance. The shifter rose to its feet, retrieving its heavy blade. Slowly, it raised it to point at Prince Felix. The prince, watching shocked from the helm of the ship, began to tremble visibly.
"The boy,"
said an ancient voice. It was dry and hoarse, as if it had not been used for years.
"By the goddess, it speaks."
Fletch's voice was almost amused.
"Me?"
Felix managed to squeak from numb lips.
"What does it want with me?"
"Do nothing, it says, Felix." Fletch had drawn Swan and was settling into a defensive stance. "You've met this fiend before, though you don't recall it. He was the one that had you trapped in Wellborough for all those years. We thought we'd seen the tell of him, but it seems our luck isn't that good. But now I think we know why the Lightkeeper fled. It must have felt the presence of this abomination." Fletch's voice was hard and pitiless, which was in stark contrast to his usual carefree tone. The shifter let out a harsh hiss that was barely audible over the scuffling and banging coming from below as Edek rampaged. "Stay well away from it. Don't let it touch you and keep us flying. Fate and I will see to our guest." Fletch moved with the grace of a swan, and his blade arched through the air, gaining a white light as it flew. The shifter met the cold, slender blade with its own heavy parry. The fox moved with a quickness, darting in and out of the shifter's range, aiming his attacks at the gaps in the heavy armor. However, the shifter, large as it was neither clumsy nor foolish, and either deflected the blows or allowed them to land harmlessly, trusting to the protection of its heavy plate. Fate had been taken aback by the rapidity of the events that had unfolded. Now she found herself in the midst of a skirmish she hadn't been prepared for. Thankfully, her body had acted where her wits had failed her, and she found that she had her longbow drawn and an arrow nocked by instinct. She drew the fletching to her cheek, looking for a moment in which to loose her dart.
"Damn it!"
Fate cursed, relaxing her draw. Fletch and the shifter were dancing the blade, and she was just as likely to hit the fool fox as she was the vile fiend. Ivy hit the deck as Fate drew her small blade and rushed to do what she could to help Fletch. The two were hard pressed. The shifter was not a foe to be dismissed easily. It had clearly had training in the blade and wielded it with a strength that surpassed either Fate or Fletch. The creature was easily as large as the biggest wolf, but that did nothing to decrease its skill. Where it lacked in agility, it made up for in strength. It knew its protection and did not fear to use it when fending off the blows of the Lightbearers. Many of their strikes landed harmlessly upon thick, plated steel. What's more, as the competition of arms progressed, the shifter seemed to not tire. As the other two began to feel the weight of their own armaments, it continued with unabated ferocity. Eventually, this got the better of Fletch. Nimble as he was, it did nothing to stop the shifter from catching Swan in an iron-bound embrace. As the two blades met, the shifter pivoted its grip, allowing Fletch's blade to slide harmlessly to land upon its thick gauntlet. Then, with its free arm, the shifter sent an ironclad backhand directly to the fox's jaw. The blow sent him sprawling upon the deck, sliding into a heap of mooring ropes coiled about the edge of the deck. Fletch managed to pick himself up on all fours, but faltered dazedly. Fate tried to take advantage of her off-balanced foe, and she aimed a pointed stab at the gap between the shifter's armor where the neck should be, below where the helm started. Her yell of defiance was cut short as the shifter whirled around, knocked her blade askew, and caught her about the neck, stifling her. The creature lifted her into the air, dangling like a caught fish. Fate struggled and squirmed, kicked and smote upon the armor of the fiend, but little good it did. It was choking the very life out of her. Little spots of light began to pop before her eyes. Fletch was still tangled in the detritus of boxes and spare rigging, trying to get to his feet again.
Is this how she would die?
Crushed in the clutches of this monstrosity. Just before she was about to pass out, she heard a yell and a rushing of hurried paws upon the deck. The shifter released her, and she gasped in lungfuls of life-giving air as she crumpled to the deck in a heap. Fate coughed and rubbed her tender neck, trying to clear her spinning head. She looked up, and as her head cleared, she saw Prince Felix facing down the shifter with his sword, torrent in paw. The prince was on the offensive, frantically swinging with wild abandon. The shifter gave way a little at the pure ferocity of the onslaught, but Felix's enthusiasm lasted only for a few more attempts before the shifter pinned the blade, and, like fate, caught the young prince. One iron-bound gauntlet held the prince's sword arm, his paw completely engulfed. Prince Felix yelled, "No!" as Torrent hit the deck, stabbing into the wood and standing upright. The shifter drew the prince in by his crushed paw, pulling him close to its dark helm and examining his scared face. The shifter reached out and grasped the prince around the front of his shirt. The dark creature hesitated, and Fate wondered why it did not dispatch him with as little ease as it had her or Fletch. Instead, it was intent on something she could not ascertain. A tremor rocked the sky darter as an explosion of fire lit the night sky. The breeze skimmer pitched dangerously to one side, and flames issued from the hold below. It seemed that Edek and the shadowy creature had destroyed something important, for one of the mechanisms had stopped rotating. The spinning fin was locked in place, vibrating harshly in the channels of wind. This calamity served one small boon, as it made the shifter drop Prince Felix in an attempt to keep its balance upon the listing deck. From the cargo hold issued a plume of flame and black smoke, and from among them clawed out Edek. His face was scratched and bloodied. His eyes mirrored the flames which swirled around him as he came forth. As the drake gained the deck, he looked around at the shifter with a deadly stare. His glance briefly flickered upon Felix, who had slid some feet away from their foe. Edek squared himself up to the dark terror, opened his maw, and let forth a rage of flames directly at the shifter. The dreaded creature shied back under the heat of the drake's inferno. Edek's flames stopped, and he pressed forward with slow determination. The drake opened his jaws and let another gout of flames free, ravaging the shifter under a torrent of fire. The shifter retreated until it was at the far edge of the Sky Darter, pressed up against the balustrade at the bow of the ship, shielding its head and face with its gauntleted arms. The flame ceased, and a black gauntlet groped about wildly for the hilt of its dreaded weapon. Edek's hind paw crushed the hand, pinning it to the deck. The drake drew himself up, raising to his full height, and took in another great breath. Towering over the dread calamity, he arched his neck, and flames issued once more from his blistered maw, canvassing the shifter in scarlet death. The heat of the flames washed back over the deck, emanating outwards like a blazing forge. As the firestorm raged, Edek came down upon the shifter with his full weight, smashing it against the balustrade of the ship with his front paws. The charred wood cracked. Once, twice, 3 times the drake smashed into the armored shifter, forcing the creature downward, back into the abyss with his great might. The balustrade gave way in a final smash, bursting apart in a cascade of flaming wood and splinters. Edek kept up the onslaught of flames while pressing down upon the creature with his full weight. The shifter's body began to slide and fall, but suddenly from the heart of the flames, a black gauntleted fist shot up, ruby red from heat, and grabbed one of Edek's horns and yanked down with force. The drake's head twisted painfully, sending flames billowing upward. The underside of the Sky Darter's ballast and rigging was coated in fire and billowing smoke. The wax rigging instantly caught alight. Edek gave a strangled cry and unbalanced as his head was pulled violently downward. There was a terrible panic sound of scrabbling claws, scales being dragged across wood, and the heavy scraping of metal armor. A flash of flame lit the edge of a cloud. A trail of smoke lingered in the soft, ambient light. There was an odd stillness. Flames crackled slowly. Then a scream broke the silence. Fate's horrified scream turned into a wail of despair that came from the very depths of her soul. Edek was gone. Just gone. There was nothing Fate could do. She sat collapsed upon the deck of the Sky Darter, wandering and witless with shock. She looked up at the burning ballast above, the last remnants of her friend, and wished she had some way to preserve those flames. An ever-burning torch. Fate was hauled to her feet by a rough paw. Everything felt so surreal. She looked around bleary-eyed and touched her face. Her eyes were wet and stung from the swirling smoke. Her attention was drawn to a frantic young rabbit hauling madly at the spoked wheel and pulling desperately at levers. She tried to move a step, but found she was trapped. When she looked down, she saw a tether fast about her. A fox had her tight about the waist and was quickly wrapping his free arm tightly about a hanging tatter of rigging. Fate saw the rabbit behind the controls duck and brace himself against the wheel. When she looked up, she saw a golden temple with ivory towers and garden paths rushing up to meet them. Fate closed her eyes and clutched tightly to Fletch. Thank you for listening to this audio recording of Lightbearer by J.A. Hawk. If you enjoyed this production, consider supporting the author's work. Your support goes a long way in helping independent artists with projects like this one. Paperback copies of Lightbearer are now available for purchase through Amazon.com. And for readers who prefer a hardback version, they may be purchased through BarnesandNoble.com. Follow the links below or scan the QR code to pick up your copy of Lightbearer today.